The black ships came from the deep darkness between stars like hungry wolves hunting for prey. The Vorthak Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their massive warships had never known defeat. Admiral Korth stood on the bridge of his flagship Death Crown and smiled as he watched another star system burn in the distance. His ship was so large it could eat small moons, and his armada stretched across space like a metal ocean of destruction. Every species in the galaxy feared the Vorthak name. When their dark ships appeared in a system, the local governments would surrender within hours. Those who tried to fight would be wiped out completely. The Talari had lasted only 6 hours before their crystal cities were turned to glass. The mighty Zenthian Republic, with all their advanced energy weapons and smart battle tactics, had fallen in just 3 days. Now it was time for the humans to join the long list of extinct races. Captain Hyun Woo stood on the bridge of the human warship Soul Pride and watched the enemy fleet approaching through the main view screen. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating fast. He knew this would probably be the last battle any human would ever fight. The ship around him was small compared to the alien vessels, barely the size of a Vorthak escort fighter. But it was home to 200 brave souls who refused to give up. Lieutenant Jin A worked at her weapons station, checking and rechecking every system while sweat ran down her face. The guns were loaded and ready, but she knew they had never been tested against Vorthak armor. Engineer Min Ho crawled through the engine rooms trying to fix damage from their last battle while cursing the aliens who had destroyed his homeworld. His engines were barely holding together, but he would make them work until his dying breath. The humans had been running for 3 weeks now, the last survivors of Earth Defense Fleet after their beautiful blue-green homeworld had fallen to the Vorthak invasion. They had watched from space as the alien ships turned their cities to ash and their oceans to steam. Billions of people had died in a single day, and now only these 200 remained to carry on the human legacy. Navigator Su Young plotted their course through the asteroid field where they had been hiding, but she knew there was nowhere left to run. The Vorthak had found them, and soon their small ship would be surrounded by thousands of enemy vessels. She had studied every battle the aliens had ever fought, and she knew they never showed mercy to those who resisted their rule. Communications officer Ye Jin listened to the alien transmissions and translated their arrogant words for the crew. The Vorthak were already celebrating their victory and discussing how they would display human prisoners before executing them publicly. They spoke of humans like they were just another weak species that would break easily under pressure. They had no idea what kind of fire burned in human hearts. Medical Officer Chan Woo prepared his sick bay for the wounded he knew would come soon. His supplies were limited and his equipment was old, but he would save every life he could. The young doctor had seen too much death already, and he was tired of watching good people die while evil ones lived. But he would do his duty until the very end. Sergeant Dong Min checked his weapons for the 100th time and made sure his Marines were ready for boarding actions. The Vorthak always tried to capture enemy ships intact so they could study the technology and torture the crews. His soldiers were scared, but they were also angry, and anger could make humans do impossible things in battle. The massive Vorthak fleet moved into attack formation like a carefully planned dance of death. Their ships were works of art in their own terrible way, covered in sharp angles and glowing with menacing red lights. Each vessel carried enough firepower to destroy a city, and the flagship alone could crack a planet in half. Admiral Korth had conquered over 1,000 worlds, and he expected this to be just another easy victory. But something strange happened when the alien fleet completed their encirclement. Instead of surrendering, like every other species had done, Captain Hyun Woo activated the ship communication system and sent a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. He told the Vorthak that humans do not surrender, that they do not kneel, and they do not break. Today the aliens would learn why Earth children were different from every other race they had destroyed. His words were simple, but they carried a power that made even the alien commanders pause. They had heard defiant speeches before, but something in the human captain voice was different. It was not the desperate bravery of the doomed, but the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were fighting for. The crew of Soul Pride stood a little straighter when they heard their captain speak, and their fear began to change into something much more dangerous. Admiral Korth listened to the human message and laughed along with his bridge officers. What could one tiny ship do against 10,000 battlecruisers? It was like an ant challenging an elephant. The alien commander decided to capture the humans alive so he could make an example of them. He wanted the galaxy to see what happened to those who dared to resist Vorthak rule. The order went out across the alien fleet to disable the human ship without destroying it completely. Boarding pods were prepared and capture teams assembled. The Vorthak warriors put on their best armor and sharpened their weapons. They had done this thousands of times before, and they expected this to be just as easy as always. None of them had ever failed to take a ship they wanted. But as the dark fleet closed in on the small human vessel, something began to change in the crew of Soul Pride. The fear that had gripped them was burning away, leaving behind something pure and bright. Lieutenant Jin A stopped shaking and her hands became steady on her controls. Engineer Min Ho felt his engines respond better than they had in weeks, as if the ship itself was eager for. Battle Navigator Su Young found attack patterns in her computer that she had never noticed before, while Sergeant Dong Min realized his Marines were no longer afraid, but hungry for the fight. Communications Officer Ye Jin heard something in the ear, Vorthak transmissions that made her smile grimly. The aliens were starting to sound less confident and more worried, as if they sensed something dangerous approaching. Captain Hyun Woo looked around his bridge and saw the faces of his crew changing, from desperate survivors into something the galaxy had never seen before. They were becoming what humans had always been when pushed to the edge, dangerous beyond measure. He knew that win or lose, they would show these alien conquerors that some spirits cannot be broken no matter how dark the odds. The first Vorthak boarding pods launched toward Soul Pride like metal meteors seeking to deliver death. The real battle was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Vorthak boarding pods screamed through space toward Soul Pride like metal bullets seeking flesh. These black spheres had pierced the hulls of countless ships across the galaxy, delivering invasion forces that would overwhelm defenders in minutes. The alien pods were covered in sharp drilling bits and powered by engines that could punch through any known armor. Their success rate was perfect because no species had ever found a way to stop them. But when the first pod smashed through the human ship outer hull, it met something the Vorthak had never encountered before. Sergeant Dongmin stood in the corridor with his Marine squad holding weapons that looked primitive compared to galactic standard equipment. Instead of sleek energy rifles that fired beams of light, the humans carried chunky metal guns that shot solid bullets. The Vorthak warriors poured out of their boarding pod wearing armor that shimmered with energy shields. These personal barriers could stop any laser weapon or plasma bolt in the galaxy. Their black suits were covered with spikes and their helmets glowed with red sensors. They had never lost a boarding action because their technology was simply too advanced for other species to overcome. But they had never fought humans before. The first alien warrior raised his energy rifle and fired a purple beam at Sergeant Dongmin. The shot that should have killed the human instantly splashed harmlessly off a simple metal plate on his chest. The Vorthak soldier stared in confusion as the human raised his primitive gun and pulled the trigger. The bullet that came out was just a chunk of lead wrapped in copper moving very fast. It was the oldest type of weapon any species had ever invented, but when it hit the alien warrior energy shield, it passed right through like the barrier was not even there. The shield had been designed to stop energy attacks, not physical objects, and the simple bullet punched into the Vorthak chest and dropped him instantly. More aliens poured into the corridor firing their advanced weapons at the human Marines, but every shot was blocked by basic metal armor. The humans fired back with their crude guns and every bullet found its target. The Vorthak warriors who had conquered 1,000 worlds were dying to weapons their ancestors might have used. The boarding party that had never failed was wiped out in less than 30 seconds on the bridge. Captain Hyun Woo watched the tactical display with growing amazement. His Marines had just done the impossible by defeating Vorthak elite troops using equipment that was thousands of years out of date. The alien commanders must be going crazy, trying to understand how their perfect warriors had been stopped by such simple methods. Navigator Su Young plotted an attack course that made her stomach clench with fear. Every rule of space combat said they should try to run and hide when facing impossible odds. But she had studied human history, and she knew that sometimes the best defense was a crazy offense. She set their heading straight toward the Vorthak flagship like they were planning to ram it. The alien fleet could not understand this suicidal behavior. Every other species would try to escape when surrounded by superior forces, but the tiny human ship was accelerating directly into the teeth of their formation, as if it wanted to die quickly. Admiral Korth watched in confusion as Sol Pride charged toward his massive battleship like a mouse attacking a cat lieutenant. Jin Ae powered up the ship main weapons, but these were not the energy cannons that most species used. Instead, the humans had built something they called railguns that used powerful magnets to shoot metal slugs at incredible speeds. The projectiles were just chunks of solid metal, but they moved so fast they carried enormous amounts of energy. When Jinny fired the first salvo, the railgun slugs crossed space in the blink of an eye. The Vorthak ships they hit were protected by energy shields, just like their warriors' personal armor had been. These barriers were designed to stop every known weapon in the galaxy, but they had never been tested against simple physical objects moving at near light speed. The metal slugs passed through the alien shields like they were made of air and smashed into the Vorthak hulls with devastating force. 3 enemy cruisers exploded in balls of fire as the primitive human weapons punched through their advanced armor. The impossible was happening. Again, as Stone Age technology defeated Space Age defenses, Admiral Korth screamed orders at his fleet to return fire immediately. Thousands of energy beams lanced out toward the tiny human ship, turning space into a light show of destruction. A normal vessel would have been vaporized instantly by such concentrated firepower. But Sol Pride was not a normal ship engineer. Min Ho had spent weeks modifying their armor using ideas he had learned from studying old Earth history. Instead of trying to absorb energy attacks, he had covered the hull with layers of reflective metal that bounced laser beams away. The ship also carried sheets of special material that would burn off when hit, taking the energy with it. The Vorthak weapons that had destroyed entire fleets barely scratched Sol Pride's surface. The alien gunners could not believe their sensors as shot after shot failed to penetrate the human defenses. Meanwhile, the primitive railguns kept firing, and more Vorthak ships died. With each hit, the human ship twisted and spun through space in ways that should have killed everyone on board. The gravity forces were so strong that any other species would have been crushed into paste. But humans had evolved on a heavy world with strong gravity, and their bodies could take punishment that would destroy other beings' pilot. Nari pushed their engines beyond all safety limits, using the ship gravity drives to create impossible maneuvers. She made Sol Pride dance between enemy fire like a leaf in a storm while never losing her target lock on enemy vessels. The Vorthak had never seen anything move so fast or so unpredictably in combat. Communications officer Ye Jin intercepted alien transmissions and heard the growing panic in Vorthak voices. The enemy commanders were trying to understand how their perfect weapons were useless against such primitive technology. Their computer models had no explanation for what they were seeing. Their entire way of thinking about combat was being turned upside down. Medical officer Chan Wu worked frantically in his sickbay as wounded crew members were brought in. The high-gravity maneuvers were taking their toll on human bodies, but nobody was complaining about a few broken bones when they were actually winning against impossible odds. He patched up the injured and sent them back to their posts with painkillers and determination. The battle that was supposed to last minutes was stretching into an hour as the tiny human ship continued to fight against overwhelming numbers. 12 Vorthak ships had been destroyed and more were damaged while Sol Pride kept moving and shooting. The alien fleet that had never known defeat was learning what it meant to face an enemy that refused to die when it was supposed to, but the humans were taking damage too. Hull breaches killed some crew members, and their ammunition was running low. Captain Hyun Woo knew they could not keep this up forever, but he also knew they had already achieved something miraculous. They had shown the galaxy that the Vorthak could be beaten, and that was worth any price. The small human warship continued its impossible dance of death among the alien giants while across the star system. Hidden survivors of other species watched in amazement. For the first time in 3,000 years, someone was fighting back against the Vorthak Empire and winning. Admiral Korth stared at his tactical display with eyes that could not believe what they were seeing. One small human ship had just destroyed 20 of his best cruisers, using weapons that were thousands of years outdated by galactic standards. His science officer Gex trembled as he reported that the human technology was primitive by any measure. yet somehow it was cutting through their most advanced defenses, like they were made of paper. The impossible battle had been raging for 2 hours now, and the tiny Soul Pride continued to dance between the massive Vorthak warships like a deadly ghost. Every time the alien fleet thought they had the human vessel trapped, it would spin away at the last second, leaving more destroyed ships in its wake. The humans moved in ways that should have turned their bodies into liquid, but they kept fighting with a fury that terrified their enemies. Communications officer Ye Jin worked at her station with sweat streaming down her face as she intercepted more alien transmissions. The Vorthak fleet commanders were starting to panic as their carefully planned attack fell apart. The enemy had never faced opponents who would not break when confronted with overwhelming force. Their entire military doctrine was based on fear and intimidation, but humans seemed to get stronger when the odds were against them. Captain Hyun-woo watched his crew work with pride burning in his chest. Lieutenant Jin Ai had become a master gunner, destroying enemy ships with every shot, while Navigator Soo-young plotted attack patterns that seemed to come from some dark corner of human imagination. Engineer Min-ho had turned their damaged systems into weapons of war using spare parts and determination that amazed even himself. The human ship used tactics that made no sense to alien observers. When surrounded by a dozen Vorthak battleships, Captain Hyun-woo ordered a ramming attack against the largest enemy vessel. The aliens watched in horror as Soul Pride accelerated directly toward their flagship like a suicide missile. But at the last possible moment, the human ship fired explosive charges that had been welded to its outer hull. The blast changed their course just enough to avoid collision, while simultaneously destroying the enemy battleship weapon arrays. It was a move so dangerous that it could have killed everyone on Soul Pride, but the human crew had executed it perfectly. The Vorthak, who prided themselves on logical military thinking, could not understand such reckless creativity in battle pilot. Nari pushed their fighter escorts beyond every safety limit, using the gravity drives in ways that created temporary distortions in space itself. These mini black holes would grab enemy ships and hold them still, long enough for the railguns to find their targets. The aliens had never seen anything like it, because no sane species would risk tearing apart the fabric of reality just to win a battle. But humans were apparently not sane by galactic standards. They fought like cornered animals with nothing left to lose except their pride. Sergeant Dong Min had armed his remaining Marines with improvised weapons made from spare parts and sent them to defend critical ship systems. His soldiers fought boarding parties in the corridors using knives and clubs when their ammunition ran out. The tide of battle continued to shift as more Vorthak ships fell to human weapons. Medical officer Chan Woo had converted his sick bay into a field hospital, treating wounds that ranged from broken bones to radiation burns. His supplies were almost gone, but he kept working because giving up was not in human nature. The injured crew members refused to stay in bed and returned to their posts with bandages still bleeding. Weapons specialist Tai Ho had run out of proper ammunition an hour ago, but he did not let that stop him. He jury-rigged explosives from cleaning supplies and spare electronics, turning household items into deadly weapons. The Vorthak had sophisticated sensors that could detect any known explosive, but they could not identify threats made from soap and wire. The alien fleet was now down to less than 8,000 ships from their original 10,000, but they still vastly outnumbered the single human vessel Admiral Korth had called for reinforcements, and more Vorthak battle groups were already heading toward the combat zone. He was determined to crush these troublesome humans before word of their resistance could spread to other species. But something unexpected was happening on the edge of the star system. Long-range sensors detected ships moving in from the outer darkness. These were not human vessels, but the scattered survivors of conquered species who had been hiding in asteroid fields and dead worlds for years. They had been watching the impossible battle between one small ship and the entire Vorthak Armada. The Talari Captain Vix transmitted to Soul Pride with wonder. In her voice, her people had surrendered when faced with just a fraction of this enemy force. Yet these humans were not only surviving, but actually winning against odds that should have been impossible. She asked Captain Hyun-woo how her stealth ship could help bringing quantum torpedoes that could punch through Vorthak armor. Soon other alien vessels began appearing from their hiding places. A Zenthian crystal ship emerged from a nebula, while Corvani raiders left their secret bases in the asteroid belt. They had all given up hope years ago when the Vorthak seemed unstoppable, but the human example was showing them that resistance was possible. The courage of 200 humans was inspiring thousands of other beings to fight. Back Captain Hyun-woo felt his heart swell as he watched former enemies become allies united in their hatred of Vorthak oppression. The communication channels filled with voices speaking dozens of different languages, but all saying the same thing. They wanted to fight alongside the humans who had shown them that the impossible was achievable. But even with these new allies, the battle was far from won. The Vorthak still had massive numbers and their reinforcements would arrive within hours. Soul Pride was taking heavy damage as enemy fire finally began to find weak spots in their improvised armor. Hull breaches were becoming more frequent, and crew casualties were mounting. Engineer Min Ho reported that their reactor was becoming unstable from all the punishment it had taken. The engines could fail at any moment, leaving them helpless in space. Lieutenant Jin A was down to her last few railgun slugs, while Medical Officer Chan Woo had run out of proper medical supplies and was using emergency rations to treat wounds. The human ship limped through space-trailing atmosphere and debris, but still fighting with every weapon they had left. The crew knew they were probably going to die, but none of them suggested surrender. They had come too far and proven too much to give up now. The galaxy was watching, and they would not let their species be remembered as cowards. Admiral Korth realized that this battle had become more than just another conquest. It was now a symbol that could inspire rebellion across his entire empire. If the humans were not stopped here and now, the Vorthak rule that had lasted 3,000 years could begin to crumble. He ordered his remaining ships to attack with everything they had, regardless of casualties. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and everyone involved knew that only one side would survive to tell the story. The battle had been raging for 3 hours when something changed that nobody expected. More ships began appearing at the edge of the star system, but these were not Vorthak reinforcements. Instead, they were the broken remnants of species that had been conquered years ago. The survivors had been hiding in the darkness between stars, watching and waiting for something to give them hope. Captain Vix of the Talari Resistance brought her stealth cruiser out of hiding along with 6 other ships that had escaped the destruction of their homeworld. Her people had surrendered after just 6 hours of fighting against the Vorthak, but now she watched in amazement as a single human vessel battled the entire enemy armada for hours, and was somehow still winning. The Talari captain opened communication channels to Soul Pride and spoke in the common galactic language. Her voice trembled with emotions she had not felt in years as she asked Captain Hyun-woo how her ships could join the fight. She had quantum torpedoes that could penetrate Vorthak shields, and a crew that was hungry for revenge against their oppressors. Soon more hidden ships revealed themselves from asteroid fields and dead worlds. A Zenthian crystal battleship emerged from a nebula where it had been hiding since the fall of their republic. The elegant vessel was scarred from old battles, but its energy weapons were still deadly. Corvani pirates left their secret bases bringing fast attack ships that could strike quickly and disappear. Even some of the smaller species that had been enslaved rather than destroyed began sending ships to join the growing alliance. Miners and traders who had been forced to work for the Vorthak suddenly turned their industrial vessels into improvised warships. The courage shown by the human crew was spreading like wildfire across the galaxy, inspiring others to take up arms. Captain Hyun-woo felt his heart swell with pride as he watched former enemies become allies united by their shared hatred of Vorthak tyranny. The communication channels filled with voices speaking dozens of different languages, but all expressing the same desire to fight for freedom. The humans had not only survived against impossible odds, but had given hope back to an enslaved galaxy. Lieutenant Jin A coordinated with the new allied ships to maximize their combined firepower. The Talari quantum torpedoes could punch holes in enemy shields, while the Zenthian energy weapons could exploit those weaknesses. The Corvani raiders used hit-and-run tactics to divide enemy attention, while the converted civilian ships provided support and supplies. But the real turning point came when Engineer Min Ho made a desperate suggestion to his captain. Their reactor had been damaged by hours of combat and was becoming increasingly unstable. The containment fields were failing, and radiation levels were climbing throughout the ship. They had maybe an hour before complete system failure would leave them helpless. However, Minho had been thinking about their situation, and he believed there might be one final option. If they could deliberately overload the reactor in a controlled manner, they could create an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to disable every Vorthak ship in the star system. The blast would fry all electronic systems within 50 light minutes, turning the enemy fleet into floating scrap metal. The only problem was that creating such a massive electromagnetic pulse would also destroy Soul Pride and kill everyone still on board. It would be the ultimate sacrifice, trading their lives to save not just their new allies, but potentially the entire galaxy from continued Vorthak oppression. Captain Hyun-woo listened to his engineer explanation and did not hesitate for even a moment. He immediately ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate in the ship escape pods while the core crew stayed behind to execute the final plan. The captain knew that someone had to remain to make sure the reactor overload happened at exactly the right moment. Communications officer Ye Jin sent messages to all allied ships telling them to retreat to minimum safe distance, while she also broadcast on every frequency so that survivors throughout the galaxy would know what happened in this star system. She wanted the story of human sacrifice to spread to every world so that others would be inspired to continue fighting. Medical officer Chan Woo helped wounded crew members reach the escape pods while Sergeant Dong Min made sure his Marines got to safety. The young doctor wanted to stay and help with the final mission, but Captain Hyun Woo ordered him to survive so he could treat the wounded among their allies. Chan Woo reluctantly obeyed, knowing his skills would be needed in the battles to come. As the evacuation proceeded, Admiral Korth finally began to understand what made humans so dangerous. It was not their primitive weapons or their reckless tactics, but their willingness to die for something bigger than themselves. The Vorthak had conquered the galaxy by making other species fear death. But these creatures seemed to embrace it when fighting for their beliefs. The alien commander had spent his entire career studying military tactics and strategy, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for opponents who saw death as an acceptable price for victory. His own soldiers fought bravely when victory seemed likely, but they would retreat when faced with certain destruction. The humans appeared to get more determined as their chances of survival decreased. Engineer Minho began the reactor overload sequence by manually disabling every safety system on the ship. Alarms blared throughout. Soul Pride, as the remaining crew made their final preparations. The escape pods launched, carrying most of the ship company to safety, while the volunteers stayed behind to ensure their sacrifice would not be wasted. Navigator Su Young programmed the ship computers to maintain position and orientation during the overload so that the electromagnetic pulse would have maximum effect on the enemy fleet. Lieutenant Jin A armed their last nuclear warheads to detonate simultaneously with the reactor, creating an even bigger explosion. Weapons specialist Tae-ho rigged every remaining explosive device to add to the destruction. The Vorthak fleet began moving in for what they thought would be the final attack on the crippled human ship. They had no idea that Soul Pride was about to become the most powerful weapon ever used in galactic warfare. The alien commanders believed they were about to capture valuable prisoners and technology, but instead they were flying into a trap that would change everything. As the reactor approached critical overload, Captain Hyun-woo stood on his bridge with the handful of officers who had chosen to stay behind. They watched the Vorthak ships closing in while their own vessel began to glow with dangerous energy. The hull temperature was rising and strange electrical discharges danced across the metal surfaces. In the escape pods, the evacuated crew members watched helplessly as their ship prepared for its final moment. Sergeant Dong Min tried one last time to convince his captain to abandon ship, but Hyun-woo refused to leave his post. Someone had to stay to trigger the overload at exactly the right moment, and he would not ask anyone else to make that sacrifice. The Allied ships retreated to what they hoped was safe distance while sending messages of gratitude and respect to the brave humans who were about to give their lives for galactic freedom. Even former enemies spoke with reverence about the sacrifice these strangers were making for people they had never met. Admiral Korth made one final desperate attempt to capture the human ship intact, sending his fastest boarding craft toward Soul Pride. But it was too late. The reactor had reached the point of no return, and nothing could stop what was about to happen. The Vorthak commander could only watch as his greatest victory was about to become his most crushing defeat. The reactor overload sequence began with Engineer Minho manually disabling every safety system on the ship. Alarms blared throughout Seoul's Pride as the crew made their final preparations. Captain Hyunwoo stood on the bridge with his remaining officers, watching the Vorthak fleet close in for what they thought would be the killing blow. Lieutenant Jin-ae had tears in her eyes as she armed the last of their nuclear warheads for maximum damage. In the escape pods, the evacuated crew members watched helplessly as their ship began to glow with dangerous energy. Sergeant Dong-min tried to convince his captain to abandon ship, but Hyunwoo refused to leave his post. Someone had to stay behind to make sure the overload reached critical mass at exactly the right moment. If they triggered it too early, the pulse wouldn't be strong enough. Too late, and the Vorthak would destroy them before the plan could work. The Allied ships retreated to what they hoped was a safe distance, while transmitting messages of gratitude to the human crew. Even former enemies spoke with respect about the sacrifice these brave souls were making. The Zenthian survivors, who had always prided themselves on logical thinking, admitted they couldn't understand the human willingness to die for strangers they had never met. Admiral Korth made one final attempt to capture the human ship intact, sending his fastest interceptors to board Seoul's Pride before it could self-destruct. But Navigator Su-young had anticipated this move. She programmed the ship's computers to fire the last of their railgun ammunition at any approaching vessel, creating a deadly barrier that even the Vorthak couldn't penetrate. As the reactor reached critical overload, Captain Hyun-woo spoke his final words into the ship's log. He said that humanity might be gone, Earth might be destroyed, but the spirit of his species would live on in everyone who refused to surrender to tyranny. The other races had shown today that courage was contagious, and maybe that would be enough to free the galaxy from Vorthak oppression. Then the reactor exploded and Seoul's Pride became a star. The electromagnetic pulse from the human ship's sacrifice spread across the star system like a wave of liberation. Every Vorthak vessel within 50 light minutes found their systems failing simultaneously. Weapons powered down, shields collapsed, and engines went dead. The mighty armada that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia was suddenly helpless, drifting in space like broken toys. The Allied fleet, protected by distance and the advanced warning from Seoul's Pride, moved in to capture the disabled Vorthak ships. For the first time in 3,000 years, Admiral Korth found himself a prisoner instead of a conqueror. As Talari Marines boarded his flagship, he could only stare at the expanding energy cloud that had once been a single human warship and wonder how such a small vessel had changed everything. News of the victory spread across the galaxy faster than light, carried by quantum communicators on every surviving ship. The impossible had happened. The unstoppable Vorthak Armada had been stopped, not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by the stubborn refusal of one human crew to accept defeat. Worlds that had lived in fear for centuries suddenly dared to hope again. The Zenthian Republic reformed overnight, with crystal ships emerging from hidden bases to reclaim their territory. The Talari organized resistance cells that struck at remaining Vorthak outposts throughout the galaxy. Even species that had collaborated with the invaders began to rebel, inspired by the example of Captain Hyunwoo and his crew. But perhaps the most important change was in how the galaxy viewed humanity itself. Before the battle, humans had been dismissed as another primitive species destined for extinction. Now they were seen as the liberators who had broken an empire that seemed invincible. The few surviving human colonies became pilgrimage sites, where aliens came to learn about the courage that had saved them all. Years later, when historians wrote about the Great Liberation, they would struggle to explain how 200 humans in one small ship had accomplished what billions of other beings could not. The answer wasn't in their weapons or their tactics, but in something much more powerful. They had shown the galaxy that sometimes the greatest victories come not from refusing to lose, but from being willing to sacrifice everything for the freedom of others. The Galactic Armada was indeed unstoppable, until it met something even stronger than fear: the human spirit that never surrenders.